All right, friends, we're reading Crossing the Creek by Michael Holmes. We are still on the subject of pain. Mental clouding. Some people are reluctant to take medications because they feel that it clouds their mind. Remember, pain clouds their mind too. It can be very difficult to think clearly when experiencing significant pain. Try solving a crossword puzzle while someone pinches your finger and a pair of pliers or sticks needles in your toes. It doesn't work well. Sometimes one has to choose between the lesser of two evils. Would you rather have your thoughts clouded by pain or from taking a narcotic to block the pain? Most people do not labor long in contemplating this dilemma before choosing the pain-free approach. However, in certain situations, a person might elect to experience a higher level of pain for a short period of time in order to participate more fully in a particular activity. Example: you are dying, but there is someone you really want to see. Who is it? This person resides far away, and it will take some time for them to reach your bedside. You consider cutting back on your pain medication in order to keep yourself more awake and your attention focused within the physical realm. You really want to see this person very badly, and you are perfectly willing to pay the price. This is a common practice among dying people and is a good example of how pain can be utilized to accomplish certain practical goals. Balancing medication and pain. In a majority of cases, a satisfactory balance can be struck between pain and mental cloudiness, and thankfully, that balance is not terribly difficult to establish. Narcotics, while dangerous when used for recreational purposes or as a substitute for healthy coping skills, are very safe when used to control pain and other noxious symptoms. Finding a good balance takes some skill, but it is not a precise science that yields excruciating pain on the one hand and overdose on the other. There is room for error without having to be fearful of disaster. Balancing pain and narcotics does not require the skill of a space shuttle pilot and is more on the level of the skill required to drive a stick shift. Also, in most cases, when a good balance is achieved, there is little, if any, mental clouding for the patient. Despite the fact that people tend to worry over this issue a great deal, in the real world it is hardly ever a legitimate concern. From what I have seen, the vast majority of what is interpreted as mental cloudiness is actually part of the normal dying process and has little, if anything, to do with drugs. Controlling pain is a means to an end. The purpose of the dying process revolves around resolving all of one's life issues. That is an enormous task, and it is accomplished much more easily when pain is properly controlled. Note, certain points begin to take on some poignancy at about this state of understanding the dying process. What we do during our lives really does matter in the end. How we judge ourselves during our dying process is a function of how we have learned to judge everything and everyone else during the course of our lives. We can resolve some of our life issues before we are actively dying, thereby reducing our workload at the time. Compassion and ritual really can help. Compassion and forgiveness can help dying people to be more loving toward themselves. Offering acceptance and understanding can be a powerful elixir. Being non-judgmental is something of a misnomer, and that we all must make judgments in order to survive. The real question is how we judge, i.e., with love, understanding, and compassion, or with harsh condemnation. Whatever the case may be, we learn to judge during the course of our lives, then have to live with that learned behavior while we are dying. Religious ceremonies focusing on forgiveness can be extremely helpful. Rituals are often effective where other tactics have failed. The urging of religious authorities can sometimes convince people to cut themselves a break. Still, there are those who prefer a fair amount of pain to an in-depth review of their own life and deeds. This may manifest as a fear of sleep with a concomitant tendency to refuse pain medications so as to stop the nightmares. Honoring the patient's wishes. It is clear that pain is a complex issue. One of the most important tasks for professionals is to assess the complexities of the individual patient and provide that patient with adequate information for making informed choices. When dealing with conscious adult patients who are able to communicate their wishes, it is neither the clinician's nor the family's role to make choices for the patient, only to provide him or her with sufficient information to make informed choices on their own. Some patients, for whatever reason, may prefer to maintain a certain level of pain. That is their choice. It is unfortunate when dying patients make choices based on poor information, but once given good information, their choices should be honored. Pain-free terminal illness. Not all terminally ill patients have pain. In fact, comfortable death is quite common. Oddly enough, these patients may demonstrate increased levels of denial regarding their true condition. We tend to associate the severity of an illness with our pain level. When comfortable, we assume things are not very critical. Terminally ill patients who have little or no pain may conclude there has been some kind of mistake in their diagnosis and simply refuse to take it seriously. The semi or unconscious patient. Medicating the semi-conscious or the unconscious terminally ill patient can be one of the most difficult tasks faced by clinicians or family members. And the absence of accurate feedback from the patient determining whether he or she is having pain may require an educated guess. Even conscious people toss and turn, make scowling facial expressions, and call out when they are asleep and dreaming. This may or may not indicate that they are experiencing physical pain. It may mean nothing more than that they are having a bad dream, and of course narcotics cannot cure bad dreams. Dying people spend a great deal of their time in a sleep or dream state. Much of that time is spent in reviewing the significant events of their lives. If a dying person is unconscious and reliving some frightening event from childhood, she or he may very well toss and turn, make scowling facial expressions, and call out. This may give the impression that the patient is experiencing physical pain, when in fact he and she may not. Administering higher and higher doses of narcotics may do more harm than good in some cases by preventing the patient from being able to wake up. On the other hand, most people would rather err on the side of being sure the patient is not suffering. These situations can be intensely difficult for family caregivers, friends, and professionals alike, and they bear witness to the value of highly skilled and experienced clinicians in the palliative care field. Loss of energy. I feel so weak. A universal symptom among dying people is a feeling of losing energy. Some people have pain, and some do not. Some people have nausea, and some do not. Some people are confused, and others are not. But everyone who dies complains of feeling a loss of energy. Basically, they feel that way because they are losing energy. It is not possible to experience a loss of physical energy and not feel like you are losing energy. Neither is it possible to overcome this sense of losing energy by taking vitamins or any other medication. In short, feeling a loss of energy while dying is unavoidable. It is my feeling that being physical requires a great deal of focused energy, when the physical body dies, that energy loses its focal point within the physical realm. This naturally leads to a sensation of losing energy. A pragmatic view of death. Consciousness may very well survive death. Indeed, I am quite certain that it does. Being around death has helped convince me of this because everything about the dying process points towards a continuation rather than a cessation of life. If something looks like immortality, acts like immortality, sounds and smells like immortality, and appears to be hurtling towards immortality, then it just may be that we are dealing with immortality. Regardless of one's religious background, the astute and pragmatic observer of the dying process cannot help but to be convinced of human immortality. Ironically enough, the dying process itself is the chief argument for human immortality. But I digress. Maintaining a physical body requires an enormous degree of focused energy, which can only be kept for a limited period of time. Being physical at all is miraculous, but sooner or later it must fade away. Maintaining the focused energy required to manifest a physical body is a lot like holding both of your arms straight out to your sides at shoulder height. At first it seems easy. Hey, I could do this forever. Well, not exactly. After some time, it becomes a struggle. Finally, it becomes impossible. As the energy required to maintain a physical body fades, the dying person inevitably feels as though she or he is losing energy. There are no health foods, no vitamins, no IVs, no pills, and no secret techniques that can change this. That is just the way it is. And that is why the one universal symptom among the dying is a feeling of losing energy. Fear, a universal emotion. Everyone has some fear of death. There are no exceptions. The degree of fear an individual feels about his or her own death may vary considerably from person to person, but everyone has some fear of death. People who are not currently facing death are often inclined to claim they have no fear. The living are very brave. Some dying people claim to have no fear of death, but frankly, I have never seen a person facing death who acted unafraid. You can say whatever you want, but it is what you do that tells the tale. Anyone can say that they have no fear of death, but acting that way is another matter entirely. Early in my career of caring for dying people, I came to this rather shocking realization and remarked to a group of other professionals that I had stopped believing people who claimed to have no fear of death. I said, the only person I might believe if they say such a thing would be Jesus or maybe Buddha. There's someone else at that meeting spoke up and said, referring to Jesus, yes, but he was afraid too. Since that time, when someone claims to be stronger or more evolved than the likes of Jesus, I take it with a grain of salt. The one situation I had hoped would prove to be an exception to this rule, that the dying process always involves some degree of fear, would be those cases when the dying person had already died, i.e., had a previous near-death experience. I was disappointed to discover that this did not bear out. True, these people have less fear and a much better understanding of what the dying process is all about, but it does not exempt them from the rigors of an in-depth life review, nor from being human, having human emotions. Accepting our emotions. When a dying person accepts that she or he may experience some fear, then that fear can be handled much more easily. Allowing oneself to feel the fear and then seeking the support of friends and loved ones is the most effective way to handle the fear of death. When approached in this way, the fear of death can be resolved in a relatively short period of time and with a minimum of fuss. Everyone has fear, even brave people. It is just that brave people have developed some skill at dealing with the fear. The dying process does not involve fear. Fear is only one part of the overall process. That part, however, always shows up sooner or later. If we burden ourselves with the unrealistic expectation that we will not be afraid of our death, we put ourselves in an impossible position. Denying our fear only makes that fear worse. The fear of death is much easier to deal with and transcend when we admit that we have it. If a person were to catch the flu and then deny that she or he had the flu, the symptoms would be more severe and last longer than if the flu were acknowledged openly and relief sought. Similarly, the fear of death is tough enough to manage without letting it run rampant by attempting to ignore its presence. When we deny our fear, it only crops up in some other guise, such as a more acute perception of physical pain or an inexplicable sense of foreboding and anxiety. Deceiving ourselves about our feelings will not make our feelings go away. It only makes them more unmanageable. The magic of human contact. One of the most effective salves for the fear of dying is the presence of other human beings. It is not necessarily what a person may say or do, but their very presence that makes the difference. We often feel at a loss for words when faced with tragedy, but sometimes saying nothing at all has the best effect. There is something truly magical about one human being simply being there for another. Never underestimate the power of your being. Seeing people who have gone before. Seeing the other side. Nearly everyone has heard of dying people seeing or talking to people who are already dead. This is so common as to be expected at some point in virtually everyone's dying process. Whether we can explain it or not is irrelevant. It happens, and it happens consistently. It is not the prerogative of people who are not yet dying to pass judgment on the validity of the experiences reported by people who are dying. When dying people report seeing dead people, then the rest of us had better pay attention. Adding to the fear. Sometimes dying people are reluctant to speak of their perceptions because they are afraid of being labeled crazy. It can be an enormous relief for them to discover that they are normal and that their perceptions are accepted by those around them. I have often had the experience of saying to a dying person, "So, have you seen your mother yet?" Then have them turn to me in astonishment and reply, "How did you know?" Unfortunately, the reports of dying people are sometimes written off as a hallucination or senility, or blamed on lack of oxygen to the brain, or too much medication, or metabolic imbalances. The attitude, unfortunately all too common, is a practical example of how the fear of death in living people may cause them to act cruelly towards dying people. This is a genuine shame for at least a couple of reasons. First, it is cruel, and second, it ruins the opportunity to learn from the dying. What dying people are experiencing is quite normal and really very wondrous from a spiritual point of view. It provides the living with a vicarious peek through a crack which only the dying can see into a larger reality. What we can learn from the dying. Caregivers to the dying are in a position to learn a great deal. The dying process is the most intense learning experience of life. Therefore, caring for people as they move through the intense learning experience is very educational. Learning about death from people who are dying is important for all of us, collectively and individually. Symbology. Describing the indescribable. As people approach death, they begin spending more time on the other side, contrary to popular belief and Hollywood representation of the dying process is usually a gradual process. Sudden, unexpected death is tragic because it bypasses normal dying processes. The normal dying process is purposeful. It enables the dying person to approach his or her transition at his or her own pace. As the dying process evolves, the person experiencing it moves back and forth between being fully awake and alert, asleep and dreaming, and perhaps semi-conscious or even unconscious. The patient may become increasingly withdrawn, or more accurately, internally focused. When not awake and conscious, they are frequently restless, moving their fingers, hands, arms, and legs about aimlessly or picking out the air. It is also common to hear them moaning, mumbling, or even crying out. All of this is indicative of how hard they are working as they process all of the unresolved issues of their lifetime. Some people maintain a remarkably high degree of waking consciousness throughout the entire dying process, approaching their actual crossing wide awake. This is more rare, but can be quite astounding and uplifting for everyone involved. Typically, these people suddenly see something which we, the living, cannot see. Their faces light up. They throw their arms forward in a gesture of joyous longing, and then they leave. That is, they die. As a person moves through the dying process, their statements, if they can be understood, may become increasingly symbolic in nature. This is because what they are experiencing and perceiving has less and less to do with the physical world. Our language is based upon our familiarity with the physical world. Describing a non-physical world in physical world terms is difficult, since dying people have no words for what they are perceiving, and they tend to speak of it in symbolic terms. Example: one gentleman I worked with, who was very near death at the time, gave the impression that he had reached the point where he was able to perceive where he was going next. I asked him if he had seen the next world yet, and replied indeed he had. I asked him to describe it for me. He thought and thought, then started to say something, but stopped and said, "No, that's not it." He thought more and more, and started to make another attempt at a description, but stopped short again. Finally he said, "Okay, 2 words, large and potent." Then he added, "But that doesn't really explain it either." After that, he gave up trying to describe the indescribable. Symbolic language. Symbolic language may be unique to the individual. When people get close to crossing over, they begin to conceptualize how they will get there. Some people talk about catching a train. Others mumble about having enough change to purchase a bus ticket. Some talk about crossing a river, while still others may mumble something about riding in a truck. Example: I grew up on a farm. When I am dying, I will naturally gravitate towards using language and expressions typical for farm boys. While growing up on the family farm, I loved to play in the creek. As anyone who has spent time playing in creeks could attest, a creek forms a natural barrier. You could only cross a creek in certain places. I used to love jumping from rock to rock, crawling along logs, or even building bridges in those places. When I am dying, people around me should not be surprised to hear me mumble something about crossing the creek. A person born in the big city would tend to use terms and expressions typical of city life. Every person is unique and likely to make unique conceptual connections. Symbolic language is metaphoric. Dying people speak in metaphors. A given individual's choice of metaphors may be difficult to comprehend, but there are common threads. If the listener is familiar with the dying person's background, the meaning behind a particular statement may become quite clear. Another example. I knew of a gentleman, he was dying, who loved mules. He had owned and ridden mules all of his life, and he put a great deal of stock in a good mule. As he lay dying, he kept talking about riding his mules along a canyon wall. He would talk about the difficulties in finding a trail that would lead down into the canyon and up the other side. I am quite sure he crossed over when he discovered the trail by which he could get his mules to the other side. Common symbols. Some symbolic terms are actually quite common. One of the most common of all statements made by dying people has to do with going home. Regardless of age, color, or creed, when people get close to death, they tend to conceptualize dying as going home. How they get there may vary a great deal, but the idea that dying involves going home is really very common. Another very common statement usually goes something like this: get me up or help me up. The exact verbiage may vary, but the general statement is common. I take this to be an indication that the dying person is receiving someone on the other side and is requesting assistance. Whether they actually receive any assistance beyond simple encouragement is an open question. Self-determination does seem to be an important element in actually crossing over. Self-determination. It seems to me that self-determination does play an important role in deciding when a dying person will actually cross over. It has been my consistent observation that those people who wait for God to come and get me, to paraphrase a not uncommon remark, spend more than the usual amount of time waiting. In other words, waiters wait. Those who take it upon themselves to get going, but only after having completed their processing. Completing the process. Dying process, like any process, has particular stages or tasks. A process cannot be completed more quickly by skipping over some of its tasks. For example, one cannot grow corn faster by skipping over the planting. Similarly, I cannot elect to duck coming to terms with my life and then merrily crossing the creek. Process is just that, process. Once the dying process is completed, the individual may elect to move on or wait, whatever strikes his or her fancy. Sooner or later, physical bodies become uninhabitable. After that, there is no more choice in the matter, and the person is basically evicted. Some dying people want to move on without completing their tasks, while others complete their tasks but decide to wait. Those dying people who complete their tasks and then decide to move on, move on. Grief. The process. Grief, like life and death, is a process. Everyone experiences grief, including caregivers and professionals. Grief runs a general course, but is not necessarily linear. In other words, a person can be in the acceptance stage one day and jump back into anger the next. In fact, people tend to hop around from one stage to another quite frequently. Grief is actually very pervasive in life. We grieve more regularly than we realize. We grieve each and every loss of disappointment that we experience in everyday life. The intensity of the grief depends upon the intensity of the loss, but we generally are not aware of our grief until it becomes intense. When grief does become intense, it may seem overwhelming, and we fear that we will never be free of it again. The intensity of our grief will ebb and flow, but it is a part of who and what we are. Not only do we grieve our losses after they occur, we grieve our losses before they occur in anticipation of their occurrence. Various authors and clinicians have compiled different lists of the stages of grief. The list given here is fairly thorough and includes some categories which may not be considered a bona fide stage. Still, they do represent common emotions experienced in the grief process and are therefore listed here. They are presented in no particular order, as they may appear in no particular order. Acceptance, shock, hope, denial, sadness, confusion, relief, bargaining, depression, anger, fear, and blaming. The intensity of our grief reflects the intensity of our loss. We can expect to go through at least some of these stages with every loss. But if the loss is severe, we may go through virtually all of them. Sometimes when we avoid dealing with the feelings associated with the little losses in everyday life, the big losses we encounter act as triggers for the release of accumulated grief. Some of the emotions associated with normal grief are surprising. For example, it is common to feel anger towards the person who has died. It is also common to feel relief that they have died. The emotions may be confusing for friends and relatives of the deceased. They may be unexpected, do not always seem to make sense, and may trigger feelings of guilt. Still, they are common and normal in most cases. Interestingly, we are often surprised to discover what a feeling actually feels like. We might wonder what it would feel like to lose a parent. We might think we could anticipate how that would feel, then be entirely shocked by the actual experience. Even professionals who deal with death and dying routinely are astonished to know how it feels to experience a personal loss. Anticipating a feeling and feeling a feeling are two very different things. Some of the emotions of grief are more difficult to deal with than the others. Anger, for example, may be difficult for some people to acknowledge within themselves. It may also be difficult to accept in others. It may help to remember that the emotion being expressed is just a part of the grieving process, and that it is better to get the emotion out than to hold it inside. Sadness is another difficult emotion. It is not uncommon for concerned family members to request a sedative, usually for someone other than himself or herself, when sadness becomes intense and tears are flowing freely. Actually, weeping is healthy when intense loss is experienced, even for men. Burying an emotion merely delays its expression and is likely to cause protracted or complicated grief with more harmful long-term consequences. If a person threatens harm to him or herself or to others in response to their grief, then she or he does need professional assistance. Barring that, the frank expression of grief is a good thing and should be encouraged. The healthiest families are the ones that encourage appropriate expression of emotion. The emotionally supportive family encourages its members to recognize and communicate their individual feelings. This allows everyone within the family to resolve his or her grief and move on in life. Allowing space for grief. In a normal grief process, every individual jumps around from one stage to another. Consequently, it is not reasonable to expect that everyone in a family will experience the same emotion at the same time. In fact, it is seldom that someone is on the same page when grieving the loss of a friend or family member. At any given moment, one family member might be angry, while another is bargaining, another is in shock, and still another might be in acceptance. An hour later, they might all have switched emotional places. It is good to recognize this and allow each other room for individual expressions of grief. Children in grief. Children should also be included and encouraged to participate in expressions of grief and loss. They should not be forced to participate, but they should be allowed to participate if they so desire. Grieving is a part of everyday life, and therefore good grieving skills should be taught to children by the adults in their lives. For children to learn good grieving skills, they must be able to see good grieving skills being practiced around them. Excluding children from loss deprives them of the opportunity to learn how to deal with loss. Children should not be banished from seeing death or dying people. Their imaginations can and will create far worse images than reality could ever produce. Reality may be tough to deal with at times, but the imagination could be a lot worse. How long does it take? There is no time limit on grief. How long it takes to grieve a loss can vary greatly and depends on a wide variety of factors, not the least of which are the severity of the loss, the support available to the individual experiencing the loss, his or her skill at working through the grief process. Strictly speaking, one never gets over a serious loss. One learns to cope, one learns to integrate that loss into a larger meaning, but one does not forget. Sharing loss. Human beings are innately social and need to share at least some of their feelings in order to process them effectively. Spending time alone is important after experiencing a loss, but it may be just as important to grieve with someone as well. The need to recall the stories of our losses is important. It is a normal and effective way of processing grief. Some people may find grief support groups to be helpful in accomplishing this task. Others may pick out a close friend with whom to share his or her feelings. Still others might utilize a professional counselor as a sounding board for ventilating their feelings. Clergy can be useful for this purpose, as can prayer and meditation. Hospices provide grief counselors. Learning to grieve. It is important to remember that grieving is something we all do from time to time. Learning to grieve effectively is an important life skill which we need to learn and pass on to our children. It enables both them and us to cope more effectively and to comprehend the meaning of our world more clearly. When grief is intense, we can quickly become overwhelmed by the magnitude of our emotions and begin to think that there is something wrong with us, that we are the first and only one to ever feel this way. We may lose sight of our profound connectedness to the human race and our commonality of emotion. As we move through feelings of isolation, we can expect to feel a need to reconnect with other humans. A time-honored way of accomplishing this is to share our story. There is a time to be alone and a time to reconnect, a time to experience solitude and a time to be nurtured. Summary. The real goal of dying process is to resolve all the events of our lifetime so as to be ready for the next phase of life. It is a huge task, but the dying process is designed to help us accomplish this goal. We are never entirely prepared for the transition of death. Even though we accumulate a great deal of experience with transitions throughout the course of our lives. Indeed, we each develop our own personal style for coping with transitions, and yet, when death does arrive, we are overwhelmed by its enormity. Transitions are essentially periods of accelerated learning and spiritual growth, though we find them to be frightening. We long for their benefits to return home. Let us go in. The fog is rising. Emily Dickinson. The dying process has taught me that all people are equal, period. In fact, we are more than merely equal. We are the same. Working with the dying has convinced me that all people are concerned in a way that is not immediately apparent in the physical realm. The practical implication is this: prejudice against another makes no more sense than being prejudiced against one's own foot, hand, or ear. This clip comes from the movie Gettysburg and is a soliloquy spoken by Kevin Conway, who portrays an Irish sergeant in the Human Army. If I find it, I'll throw that in the hot pocket. That got me in the end, huh? I really felt that. And some of this is going to hit home hard for me, for reasons that will become all too apparent for those who don't know me personally. I like the second half a lot because this guy doesn't fuck around. He's saying, look, I've been close enough to this long enough, all right? There's an afterlife. He just comes out and says it. There's those of us who are kind of looking for a continuum. There are those of us who don't want to separate belief from experience. I want to encourage that openness. A lot of people draw out these boundaries. They let reality support their belief system, but they are not open to, the big picture, essentially. And part of that dying process is letting go of beliefs that no longer serve us. The material is not just hitting home because of what's going on in my personal life, but in my professional life as well. This is one of those cases where, I'm working with someone who is, pretty close to the edge. His significant other is literally never say die. And so, they have this tension. He's pulling away, he's looking at this whole other realm that exists outside of, the rough and tumble purview of this, solid stuff. But that doesn't mean what he's experienced is any less more real. All of this I've taken to heart, I've integrated into my life, not just professionally, not just with other people, but we're dying right now. Every step we make is closer, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's just depending on how we come to terms. And the truth is that I'm not wasting any time. I've done my best to optimize my relationships with other people, as if it were possible that I could die tomorrow. I'll still feel fear towards the end. I don't think I'll feel as much fear as the average person because I'm allowing the lines to blur between life and death, between temporary and immortality. I'm conditioning myself to feel holy moments in my life. This is one of them for me. You sharing this with me is holy. It's a big deal, and it's a good thing. So as always, I'm going to encourage comments. Like, share, subscribe is all appreciated, but I want to hear words from you. This is heady stuff, so any impressions based on the material, if there's anything about this that you've seen, if there's an experience you've had with a dying person that makes sense, by all means share it. Or if there's things that seem different, it seems different either for you or for family members, for friends that are crossing that creek, please let me know about it. I am interested. And please stay tuned for more readings. There's going to be random readings that'll be the nonfiction stuff, and eventually we'll branch out to Storybook Sundays and get a little fiction in there. Tell a story, have a little fun. All right, my friends, look at me. I love you.